Greetings, everyone. I welcome you to today's episode of Conflicts and Contradictions. Today, we will discuss the contradictions that arise when a democratic country goes to a war, which is neither in its defense nor has been thoroughly debated among those individuals who represent the interests of its ordinary people. I hold the position that all such war is perpetual absurdity, and I defend my position based on four observations, which are four contradictions. And when we view our recent history through the lens of these contradictions, it raises a question that has yet not been answered, and I will finish my episode by providing you with that question to think about. So let us begin our episode. When a democratic country goes to war, if it is not in its defense, and if it has not been approved after a thorough debate among those who indeed represent the interests of its ordinary citizens, then such a war leads us to four contradictions, which we will discuss in a moment. And when we view our recent history of, let's say, last 2 decades through the lens of these contradictions, it raises a question. Let us first identify those contradictions and then ask ourselves that question, the answer to which is yet to be found. Before we begin, let us note 2 points. First of all, the premises of this argument are not of a pacifist but a pragmatist. That is to say, I do not assume pacifism for sake of pacifism. In the same manner, I oppose war for the sake of war. Instead, the premises assume that all that is done is for achieving the goals of a society or a country which is democratic. Second, this is mainly a theoretical argument, although it has some input from history. The argument concludes that perpetual war is perpetual absurdity. And the end this argument serves is to provide us with a framework for understanding issues of recent US wars and understand why such wars are a violation of reason and pragmatism. Now, let us go through our argument, which is composed of 4 parts, which are 4 contradictions, which arise when a democratic country goes to a war which is neither in its defense nor thoroughly debated among the representatives. These 4 contradictions are interrelated. First of all war is financed by the resources which are supposedly collected each year via taxes or other means for the welfare projects such as free education, universal health care, building infrastructure, and all other socio-economic projects of public sector. This also includes different means for stimulating economy, for improving its growth. Moreover, the government in a democracy is elected by its ordinary people to represent their interest and identify and then solve their problems. Thus, it is natural that revenue collected in a fiscal year by taxes or other means should be spent on the aforesaid projects for the social and economic welfare, unless all problems of the ordinary people are solved, all social economic issues resolved. The priority is and ought to be all such domestic issues when deciding about spending of revenue. Accordingly, it is natural to conclude that if a government spends on a project other than welfare, whereas welfare projects are needed, it incurs an opportunity loss to the entire society. And thus, it follows that unless a real threat, that is to say, an attack on country, unless defense is necessitated by external conditions and is justified after a thorough debate and reason among the elected officials, an offensive war would shift the scarce resources collected in a fiscal year towards an end which is unnecessary, which is wasteful, which does not serve the interests of the society. And as a matter of fact, since war is unnecessary, while there are other necessary expenditures remaining, it is an opportunity loss. Since people in a democracy vote politicians to represent and solve their problems, if war is not needed, that is to say, there is no solid justification for a defensive war, whereas other issues at home are needed to be solved, spending on such a war is essentially a betrayal of trust of voters, a moral hazard by the representatives, a bamboozlement of the represented, and as such, also the stealing of resources of people. It is a loss of democracy. The war by a democratic country thus becomes undemocratic and is the first contradiction. The contradiction between the claim of the government, that is to say, it is a democracy, and the practice, that is to say, it violates the trust of people and shifts the scarce resources towards an end which does not serve people. Hence, the first contradiction is contradiction with democracy. Second, moving to the next contradiction, we can see that such a war does not only devour the resources supposedly collected for a country's development, such as infrastructure, hospitals, schools, and all such things. But such a war damages, as we have seen in the last 2 decades in Middle East, the infrastructure, the hospitals, the schools, and all other things of the country invaded. As we have seen, such a war is not kept limited to the borders and between soldiers, but essentially extends to cities and citizens of the country invaded. This extension by all means is unjust and inhuman. All these observations force us to ask one question. Which individual in all his or her sanity incur a loss at home only to incur additional losses abroad? The irrationality of recent US wars is that instead of using all the resources at home for building infrastructure, for providing free or cheap education, free universal healthcare, and many other activities, which may in fact include extending United States interest abroad, such as China has been doing with Belt and Road Initiative. The irrationality of recent US wars is that instead of using all the resources on such projects, it directed all of its own resources towards destroying the same and even much more in other countries. With trillions of dollars spent in the last 2 decades on wars, the losses of Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Libya are not only large, but they are irreversible. And at once the development at home in United States has been sluggish or sometimes negative in terms of resolving real issues, as mentioned before. In fact, with such an amount of money, US could have certainly achieved remarkable progress in terms of universal healthcare, free education, building infrastructure. It could have mitigated the consequences of financial crisis and recession. It could have reduced poverty, improved research, and the list is very long. As some countries do, they loan their excess financial resources to other countries and use the interest payments they receive to finance additional projects home. China and Norway have successfully been doing the same. Their strategy in China resulted in economic power, and in Norway, a welfare state. Observing all of this and knowing that much of the US wars were debt financed, we naturally can ask only one question. What is worst form of irrationality than this? To bear a loan for an unjust, needless war. We will discuss debt in a moment. Thus, for all these reasons, the war, which is undemocratic, becomes irrational too. The irrationality of it is its self-contradiction. To endure self-harm for inflicting harm on others, or to destroy assets of others by losing your own assets. We call this absurdity rather than a contradiction because it is an absurd activity to carry out. Moving to the next contradiction, we can observe that such an undemocratic, irrational war then creates additional foes rather than defeating existing enemies and ending existing animosities. As we have seen, the countries invaded suffered huge losses from lives of ordinary citizens to their homes, their colleges, their schools, their hospitals, their entire infrastructure, their peace and security, and all that is there. And this results in resentment, which is so strong, so aggressive, it becomes active revenge seeking. This creation of animosities is irrational and at once inhuman. Since the justification of war is often to defeat enemies, but instead when war is not defensive, not democratic, not rational, but is undemocratic, offensive, irrational. It creates a sense of revenge among those suffering from it. And all of this creates potential or real enemies. As this war extends to cities and injures citizens, all of them become potential recruits for the so-called terrorists who seek revenge. The birth of more and stronger enemies means more war in future, and thus more resources diverted from social projects towards war. As we have observed, the enemies defeated were neither real enemies nor strong ones. Take, for instance, the case of Iraq and its weapons of mass destruction. However, most of resulting so-called jihadists are terrorists who are strong and pose a real threat, not just to United States, but to everyone. Thus, the undemocratic, irrational war becomes an inhuman perpetual war because the enemies created in the process of defeating visible weak enemies are invisible strong ones. And since they seek revenge, and since that they are invisible, it remains difficult, very difficult, to defeat them. And thus, it indefinitely prolongs the war. The contradiction to note here is of creating more and stronger enemies for defeating few and weaker enemies. When war is waged to defeat an enemy and ends creating more, it contradicts with its purpose. That is to say, the contradiction is between proposed justification of war, which is to defeat an enemy for sake of defending homeland from a potential threat, and the executed strategy which, instead of ending potential threat, creates more. Moreover, for all the said reasons, as the enemy now is invisible and strong, there now exists a perpetual war, a war against some invisible strong enemy who could be everywhere. And in this atmosphere of total uncertainty, when further warlike activities are conducted, chances remain that it inflicts more unjust injuries, or at least disturbs the lives of ordinary people. Either of this results in potential recruits for the terrorists, or in the minimum, their passive supporters, because the initial war was unjust. And this further prolongs the war. And it is next to impossible to defeat an invisible enemy. History demonstrates that the invisible enemies, guerrilla wars, wars that expand to cities and offices, when all of it becomes a new Cold War of some sort, history bears the evidence that such wars are prolonged and can extend upon several decades. And since, following earlier reasoning, This war is not only undemocratic, unjust, but an irrational one. And as explained recently, it is now a perpetual one. This war, thus, is a perpetual absurdity. A perpetual absurdity in the history of a country. Let alone that twice such absurdity landed United States in shame. Vietnam and Syria will be remembered in the annals of history as defeats of weaker strategies of the mightier by the stronger strategies of the weaker. The perpetual war, which is in fact a perpetual absurdity, only invests in weakening of the country's image, which once more contradicts the expected functions of a democratic government. Finally, the last contradiction becomes visible when the war is financed by debt, which as a matter of fact was the main tool used to finance Afghan and Iraq wars. In case of debt, it must be returned by the public sector, which can return it if it has invested the debt on improving economic conditions, which in turn improve economy, which in turn improve tax collection. However, no such investment takes place. In fact, resources are diverted towards war from such investment projects. The invading country ends up in a debt trap. More debt for paying existing debt taken for war, and then additional debt for more wars, which are the consequence of creating more and stronger invisible enemies. For returning the war debt, public sector in the subsequent years after war either can take more debt or impose more taxes or direct most part of the tax money collected towards payment of debt or print new money, which causes inflation. All of this implies that not only during war, but even after war, if it was debt financed, resources which ought to be spent on welfare of people will be spent on something else. Something which is not welfare, something not of the choice of people, something which is an opportunity loss, since the resources now being spent need to be spent on more critical and important projects of society. And this brings us to question: was war an agreed decision? Were people voting for it? If not, it is betraying and stealing of the resources of voters twice. First, for war, and then for paying war debts, all of which was never chosen by people. And since the war now is perpetual war, this creates a cycle of debt for debt repayments and debt for financing more war because of new enemies. Thus, such an undemocratic, irrational, inhuman, perpetual war inevitably becomes a perpetual violation of trust of voters, a perpetual stealing of their resources, a perpetual loss of trust on democracy, and thus a perpetual violation of democracy itself with real chances of decay of democracy into autocracy. And the contradiction here is twofold. First, it violates simple economics sense. That is to say, would you better invest $1 today to have another dollar tomorrow? Or would you lose it and worse, end up in a debt of an additional dollar that you have to pay tomorrow? As an economist, I would choose the earlier option and invest and expand my resources. Whereas in the recent wars, the opposite can be observed. That is to say, not only to exhaust existing financial resources, but end up in more debt. And thus a second contradiction arises, which is the same as the first contradiction we discussed. That is to say, the contradiction against democracy. But with one fundamental difference. This time, it perpetuates and drags alongside all other contradictions of war as we discussed here. Thus, this undemocratic, irrational, inhuman, perpetual war is put simply a perpetual absurdity in the history of a country. To summarize, a war which is not defensive and whose reasons are not justifiable or rational is a war which is undemocratic, violating of the trust of people, irrational, inhuman, and creates more enemies, all of which results in a state that war becomes perpetual and at once becomes a perpetual violation of democracy, a perpetual human abuse, a perpetual self-destruction, or put simply, all war which is not defensive or which is unjustifiable is inhuman and irrational and inevitably creates vicious cycle of total destruction of all those involved and thus a perpetual absurdity. Such a war violates democracy and incurs self-harm by diverting resources from needed welfare projects only to destroy others at a cost which needs to be paid back in future by further violation of democracy. That is to say, further shifting of resources away from welfare towards war or war payments. And at once, the invader faces new threats created by the crimes of this unjust, inhuman war, and thus needs further resources for defense while still needing to pay earlier costs of war. And all of this is not only inhuman, but more importantly, irrational. Since a sophisticated approach would be to spend money home, strengthen home defense, and use traditional ways, that is to say, diplomacy and intelligence, to improve home defense, which are the least cost methods aimed at bringing to an end animosity rather than enemy himself. And at once they also help defending or extending a country's interest abroad. Thus, a violation of this sophisticated stance is irrational, and its absurdity results in a vicious cycle of war after war, which is inhuman. Thus, a perpetual war exists, and this perpetual war is, in fact, a perpetual absurdity if viewed from the position of a pragmatist. But if all such war is undemocratic, we may quickly recall that US is a plutocracy, an oligarchy of the rich. And as the evidence from the recent research by Princeton University shows, summarized earlier, that preferences of ordinary people do not enter in policy decisions, and policies are sensitive to the choices of rich. Then we can just be silent and say United States is a plutocracy and thus the wars are the result of their egocentric pursuits. The egocentric pursuits of the rich for whom the world is a video game. An age of empires where you must build an empire on the blood of many and call it glory. Only if this was true. If plutocrats wanted to expand an empire, we would have seen a rational approach, since you cannot build an empire on absurdity. The wars we have seen in the last 2 decades are wars which are not only inhuman wars, which are not only inhuman but more importantly irrational, unsophisticated. Whose interest is it to invade a country and destroy a country's infrastructure, schools, colleges, and hospitals, using the resources which can be used to build and improve the same at home, and in all that create further enemies? This is destructive and risk-seeking behavior rather than constructive and risk-neutralizing behavior, which is what a rational individual would do. This case of war, this direct demonstration of irrationality, forces us to think who benefits from such war. Of whose interest is it to wage a war of such nature? Even if US is a plutocracy, the rich would, if they are sane, and it is difficult to believe they are not sane, if they are sane, they would have behaved in a sophisticated manner as described previously. Would they not? Let us say they want to establish an empire. Then, following the preceding ideas and reading history and economic theory, it is evident that an empire is always an economic empire. Economics is the core, politics is the extension. So let us say that the richest few wish to establish an empire across the globe. Then it would most certainly be an economic empire. Thus, would it not be in their interest that their empire expands such that the resources of their opponents, whom they conquer, are captured intact, and the entire infrastructure and all the organized system of cities and political setup and everything remains safe from any harm, undisturbed, so that it can be used for their own economic and political pursuits? For any sane person, it would be the case. Let us talk a bit politics here. Wars have been in our history, and expansion too. But in our history, we have seen that the sophisticated emperors would be interested in capturing resources intact so that they may be put to use. Their opposition was limited to the political elite, whom they wished to replace so that they may enjoy the political and economic monopoly. A monopoly was sought, not destruction. And for this reason, cities were never destroyed, unless we had, of course, mad emperors. Reading a classic such as Sun Tzu's Art of War, the message is abundantly clear that we must reduce cost of war and at best avoid it. Use lateral means to bring to an end animosities, and most importantly, capture the resources intact. For the whole purpose of war is not an irrational pursuit of destruction, but essentially expansion of economic interests by controlling of the economic means of production, so as to satisfy the underlying selfish interests. And in recent US wars, if oil was the economic interest, it could have been captured in a different way, in a way to cause the least damage to the other countries, in a more lateral manner, more diplomatic and sophisticated manner, say by acquiring favorable contracts, favors within the political elite, favors within the government, etc. The sophisticated and least cost method was avoided in favor of creating more enemies and losing own monies. An irrational inhumanity was demonstrated. Take, for instance, China. They have invested hugely in their own country and expanded not the political, but so exclusively their own economic interest abroad, by means which also satisfy the economic needs and ends of the other countries. And in all of this, they have now more economic power, and their economic expansion has given them, accordingly, more political power, something which China was not pursuing at all. And in this China model of expansion, no sovereign nation is hurt. Their infrastructure is in fact improved, which is a long-term investment in their economy. And all of this benefits both nations. All of this creates stronger ties among all the nations involved. All of this helps ordinary people. And all of this is sophisticated, reasonable, humane. And if you see carefully, it is democratic. For democracy is a system which works for the betterment of people. And this model of China is deeply rooted in the concerns of pragmatism. The purpose of example of China is to show that what could have been achieved with trillions of dollars that were spent if they were spent in a sophisticated, rational manner. If they were spent in a rational manner, US could have achieved the same both inside and abroad. Instead, all it did was to ignore domestic issues and create more issues across the globe for itself and for everyone. Thus, it is irrational. But all of this brings me to the question, whose interest is being satisfied in all of these wars? Clearly, it is not the United States' interest, not even the interest of the plutocracy dominating America. For if the ultra rich want to have an empire, they would have done it in a sophisticated manner and expanded carefully and, most importantly, in an economic fashion. However, it has not been the case. So, who is benefiting from a total destruction of either sides of the world? For me, as an economist, a simple logic is cost of an activity must essentially be lower than the benefit. Thus, I ask you, all of you, the question: who benefits by using United States resources which can be used for its own development of infrastructure, education, healthcare, and all else, only to destroy all of this and even more in Middle East and in other places, especially when more sophisticated and least cost methods were possible, which would have not hurt the interest of any of the countries. This question I leave to you to answer. Who is benefiting from this absurd and all round destructive activity? So, this finishes our episode, and I emphasize that you do go through this question and think about it. And I propose that you also visit Brown University's Watson Institute Cost of War project. They have sufficient data and done very thorough research about this very topic. And in my subsequent episode, I will try to measure using data the opportunity losses which America incurred. Till then, take care. See you very soon.